презентации Сташи. Она представляет международную организацию секс-работников. Саша,
Hi, my name is Stasa Plecas. I'm the Executive Director of the Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy Network in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I'm not a very good public speaker, especially when I'm not prepared.
Сташа, скажи сокращенно, вот переводчики не успели перевести название организации.
SWAN, Sex Workers' Rights Advocacy Network in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Хорошо?
Да.
Okay. I'm just going to give maybe a brief overview of the region because we have partners not just in Ukraine but in a lot of countries, in about 20 countries in the region. We published a paper maybe a couple of 6 months ago or so. It's an overview of the legal environments in mainly Eastern Europe, Central Asia. And it's categorized by either being criminalized, penalized, if there's administrative laws that apply, and so forth. So there's differences between countries. One thing that is completely the same is that all of these laws have pretty much the same effect, that the level of violence and discrimination is extremely high in all of the countries. Now, sometimes we hear people say that that in Kyrgyzstan, for example, in another country, I'm not sure, that sex work is decriminalized there, which is not really entirely correct because it's just not mentioned in the law. It's in a gray zone. That's not to say that sex workers aren't affected by other laws. Laws on morality, public health laws, and any other bylaws that could be used against them, vagrancy, drug use, etc. I really do wish that Catherine Healy from the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective was here, because she, when she presents on how they did decriminalized sex work in New Zealand, she goes into great detail in explaining the process of it, which was inclusionary. And she talks about how they sat down to have discussions and dialogue, meaning that sex workers and government institutions and other stakeholders sat at the table and had conversations around sex work laws. And I'm saying that in that when we heard Kate speak, and when we heard Christina and Miriam speak today, it's clear that trying to unpack a law in any given country, also you have to try and come at it from a perspective of what were they actually trying to do and achieve. And in most of the environments that we've heard of had legal environments that we have reports of, or the way that regulation is presented, regulation or legalization, is you come at it from, you understand later that what the law was. And at the center of those was not the protection of the human rights of sex workers, and it was not about labor rights. It was purely exclusionary to say, well, this group of people can maybe work, and these groups of people definitely cannot work. And demand models in a lot of the Nordic countries have mostly to do with keeping migrants out, with the rhetoric of anti-trafficking. So in talking about changing laws in a country, it has to be contextualized within that country or region. What we've heard, so the reports coming in to us from all of the countries is that there is still this dichotomy between the traditional viewing of the woman in our post-socialist or post-Soviet environments, or the more religious kind of context in Central Asia, where, well, the woman, you're not really looking at her as a victim of domestic violence because she must have been immoral, or she must have been this. Like now, the new law in Russia where domestic violence isn't really considered a criminal act and so forth. With the newer trends of completely fucking crazy abolitionist feminists coming in with their ideas about everything being an act of violence against a woman, which is extreme to one end. Coming into an environment where they have, for example, managed in Serbia to get insider information that an administrative code is going to be opened for review, and they got themselves invited behind closed doors to then review the article on prostitution and just include penalties for clients as well, without removing, of course, the penalties for sex workers. They've done so behind closed doors, and those types of organizations do not actually take into consideration what the repercussions for the sex worker community are. And the repercussions are that organizations don't know anymore where the sex workers work because they have to hide, because their clients are hiding. Or they simply leave the country and move on to work in Austria, where we've heard what the situation is like, or completely different countries. So all of these discussions around sex worker legal reforms have to first, of course, engage sex workers, and they have to be meaningful in that they consider all of the aspects of what the effect of those laws is going to be on that community, and not necessarily on public health, as they usually are in regulated countries, where you have nonsense laws where somebody has to go get a checkup every 2 weeks, which is complete nonsense. Or when you have, and I've heard this question asked many times, well, what is the taxation law? That then is speaking to actually, obviously there is no social security, even if you pay taxes, there's no benefits in Ireland. But that speaks to somebody else's interest, which is the government. And again, not the sex worker community. So I think when we're speaking about the changes of laws, it needs to be a process that is understood by all parties. And I think it needs to be meaningful in the sense that all aspects of it are looked at, including migrants, who usually also work in gray zones in the labor market that isn't quite regulated. So basically, I would just urge everybody who has a stake at the table and in this dialogue to keep in mind the human and labor rights of sex workers.
Спасибо, Саша.